Chapter 7 Navajos Wanted. Over the next days, we learned more about the air raid on Hawaii. We heard the names of islands thousands of miles away where the Japanese were attacking American and Allied bases in the Pacific. Even I, who loved geography, had never heard about most of those places. I had to look hard through the maps in my geography book to locate them. Wake Island, Guam, Guadalcanal. By Christmas of 1941, all of those places had fallen to the empire of the rising sun. You must all sacrifice to help the war effort, our teacher said. Even though I understood what they meant, I could not help remembering that we Navajos had already sacrificed a lot. Most of our families were still poor because of the government livestock reduction of our sacred lands. Of our sacred herds. Not sacred lands, of our sacred herds. None of our people were as wealthy as any of the Balaganas we saw, especially those who ran the trading post. Poor as we were, we Navajos really did want to help. Our tribal council met at Window Rock and declared war on Germany, Japan, and Italy. Navajo men took their guns, packed supplies, and rode their horses in to report to the Indian agent. They did not know how far away Pearl Harbor was, but they were ready to go there and fight the enemy. However, almost all of those men were told they could not be warriors for the United States because they only spoke Navajo or because what English they spoke was not good enough. That made them sad and ashamed. I wanted to join up too and go fight the enemy. I could speak English well, but I was only 14 when that attack came on Pearl Harbor. That was far too young, and I was too small to convince anyone that I was older. This war will be over, I said to my friends, before I am old enough to enlist. At first, that is what many people thought. Now that Americans had declared war, Mr. Straight said, shaking his bony finger at the sky, the fighting will soon be over. Everyone on the radio and in the newspapers agreed. The Axis powers, that was what they called Japan, Germany, and Italy, would quickly crumble. Sadly, we were all wrong. As the months wore on, it became clear that this war was going to be a long one. It also seemed that the U.S. Armed Forces was yet another place where Indians were not wanted. Only a few Navajos had been accepted as U.S. soldiers, all of the men who had been to mission school. There seemed little interest on the part of the U.S. Armed Services in enlisting the help of those of us who had loved this country long before the ancestors of the Balaganas came here. Then in April of 1942, everything changed. A message from Chi Dodge, our Navajo tribal chairman, was sent around the reservation by shortwave radio. A Marine recruiter was coming to Fort Defiance looking for Indian volunteers. Not just any Indians, but Navajos. Navajos were needed for special work. The Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs had given its sanction for Navajos to join up. However, only men fluent in both English and Navajo were wanted. When I heard that announcement on the radio, I could hardly speak. Navajos! I finally managed to say to my friends, Navajos? They want Navajos! Did you hear that? I was so excited and talking so fast that they teased me. Are you sure that's what they said? Tommy Nas asked me. Wee-hee, Jessie Chi said. Yeah, didn't they say they wanted Mexicans? But that radio announcement interested those guys too. Our high school was not far from the tribal offices in Fort Defiance. The Marine Corps recruiter was scheduled to speak the next morning, a Saturday, which meant we had no classes to attend. So the three of us went down there together, just to look at that recruiter. He had been given an office right near our Navajo tribal headquarters, and we could see that the door was open. We quietly crept up and peeked through the door. A tall, broad-shouldered white man wearing a neat, well-pressed uniform sat at a desk. He seemed very serious. He sat with his back straight, writing something on a pad of paper. Perhaps it was the recruiting sheet that he was about to give. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out on the page. We were perfectly quiet. I am sure he did not notice us peering in. He was impressive to see, but what was even more impressive were the things hung on the walls around him. "Look at that," Jesse Chi whispered, pointing with his chin. We looked. There hung a beautiful sword in a silver case. Just below it was a fine rifle. To either side of the rifle and sword were posters that showed Marines standing tall in their full dress uniform. One of them in the most colorful poster of all looked much like the recruiting sergeant himself. However, the uniform of that poster Marine was much more striking than this. That uniform, it was so beautiful to behold. The coat and trousers were made of cloth that was as shining and blue as the sky. The cap and gloves were white as clean new snow. The leather boots were as black and polished as jet. "Did you see the uniform in that picture?" Tommy Nez said after we were back out in the street. "Boy, that was sharp. I'd sign up just to have a uniform like that one." The three of us decided to hang around until the straight-backed white Marine gave his talk at 11 a.m. It was quite a speech. "My name is First Sergeant Frank Shin," he said in a loud, clear voice as he stood on the steps of the tribal offices, looking out at the crowd of people who had gathered around. Looking back on that day, I wondered what he thought of those Navajos gathered there in front of him. Some in the crowd, like my friends and me, were short-haired and dressed much like any white man would dress. Only the brown of our faces gave away the fact that we were something other than the usual people who would hear such a recruiting speech. But there were also many in the small crowd who were far different from those he was probably used to seeing. There were men with blankets over their shoulders and rifles in their arms, men wearing headbands or tall black hats, women in long, colorful dresses with shawls. The glitter of silver and the glow of turquoise shone out from the crowd in the shape of necklaces and bracelets and earrings on the women, belt buckles and hat bands on the men. No one stared up at the first sergeant, yet there was complete silence as he spoke. "I'm a Marine and proud to be one," First Sergeant Shin continued, his voice echoing down the street. He looked around the crowd as if daring anyone to contradict him. "The Marines need a few good men. There will be real opportunity for you if you enlist. It will be better for you than staying here on the reservation. As a Marine, one of the proud and few, you will have the chance to travel, learn new skills, and meet interesting people." Of course, he did not mention that some of the interesting people you would meet might be holding guns and sharp samurai swords, shouting "Banzai" and trying to kill you. If he had, I still do not think it would have frightened away any Navajo recruits, even though some who enlisted that day, and in the days following, figured that they were heading for some kind of desk job and not into combat. It seemed to me that this Marine recruiter was telling us the truth. We Navajos have enlisted, what it actually says is we Navajos have listened to white men speak for a long time, and we have learned to tell when one is trying to deceive us. You can tell a lot about a man by the way he speaks and the way he carries himself. Looking at First Sergeant Shin, I could see that this was indeed a man who believed in what he said. I was ready to believe it too. I wanted to become one of the proud and few. But there was a problem. They were only accepting men between the ages of 17 and 32. I was still only 15 years old. Yes, grandchildren, this was quite a problem, but right away, I thought I saw a solution. In those days, none of us had birth certificates. Nearly all of us were born at home and not in hospitals, with only our families and a midwife present. As a result, the only way the Bolagenos knew the age of any Navajo was based on what age that person or the person's family said. If my parents claimed I was old enough, I could enlist. I went home and told my parents that what I wanted them to do. Sorry, this sentence says, I went home and told my parents what I wanted them to do. They listened carefully. Son, my mother said, wait outside while your father and I talk of this. I did as they asked, as I sat leaning against the wall of our hogan with the warm sun on my face. I could hear their soft voices speaking, but I could not understand what they were saying. A lizard ran up to my feet, stopped, bobbed up and down, and then ran off again. Finally, my parents called me back in. Son, my father said, we are proud of you. What you want to do is a good thing. However, your mother and I both think that you are not yet old enough. You are still too young to become a Marine. Wait through another winter. If this war is still going on, then we will give you our blessing to join up. I was disappointed, but I did as they asked and went back to school. So it was that I was not part of the 1st Navajo platoon, those 29 men who developed our secret code. I'm going to go ahead and read Chapter 8 as well in this video. Chapter 8 is pretty short. I will go ahead and read it. Chapter 8, New Recruits. Meanwhile, the interviews to find that first group of Navajos for special duty were going on. 2 weeks passed before they had finally chosen all the men they wanted for that first group. 29 in all. Each man was physically examined at Fort Defiance Public Health Service and carefully questioned to be sure he was really able to speak both Navajo and English fluently. Each man's age was checked too. No one over 32 or under 17 was supposed to be accepted. But one of those chosen, Carl Gorman, was actually 35, although he listed his age as 32. Another man, William Yazzie, was only 16, but said he was a year older. All through this period of selection, no one was told what that special duty would be. Early on the morning of May 4th, 1942, those 29 men of what would be the first all-Navajo platoon, the 382nd, boarded a bus at Fort Defiance. Some of their friends and families watched as that bus headed southeast in the direction of Tzotzis, Mount Taylor, the sacred peak that marks the southern boundary of Dainta. Then they were gone, vanished. It was as if they had fallen off the face of the earth. For no word was heard from them. Not a single letter was received by any of their families who had been left behind. A month passed, and then another month. Now, their families back home were getting worried. Some knew a little bit about the armed forces from having served in World War I after 6 weeks of boot camp. New recruits are always given a 10-day pass. But not one of those 29 men came home on leave, and there were still no letters. Wilcie Bitsie's father was a schoolteacher. His son had promised to keep him informed of how he was doing. Carl Gorman's father was influential in the politics of our tribe and a successful businessman. Both Mr. Bitsie and Mr. Gorman decided to do something. They wrote directly to the Marines and complained to the Indian agent. They expected answers, but when those answers came, they were not very satisfactory. All they were told was that their sons were doing well, but they were on special duty and could not communicate with anyone. After a while, when no one had heard anything from those first 29 Navajos, people began making jokes about what must have happened to them. One joke was that the white men must have eaten them. When someone said that to me, knowing how much I still wanted to be a Marine myself, I had an answer for them. Well, I said, I have always wanted to see what it was like in a Balagana kitchen. Those jokes finally stopped 4 months later when one of those 29 men suddenly reappeared at Fort Defiance. When he had left, we had simply known him as Johnny Menelito. He had graduated from Navajo High School several years before and was still remembered there as a serious and hardworking student. Now he was a different man. He was Corporal John Manuelito of the 382nd, and he wore the bright, impressive uniform of a U.S. Marine. The other Navajo men of the first 29 had been sent on assignment overseas. But he and John Benelli, another member of the Navajo 382nd, had been given a different job. They were staying on as instructors for the next group of Navajo recruits. Johnny Manuelito's duty was to recruit from our eastern half of the Big Navajo Reservation. He did so in style, wearing his spotless new corporal's uniform as he spoke on street corners and in chapter houses. People were impressed not just by his words, but by how he looked. Those who had known him before said that he truly seemed to be a different person. He looked to have grown taller during the short time he was gone, and he carried himself more like a white man than an Indian. When he came to our high school and spoke to the student body, his words reverberated in my mind like drum beats. "The Marines," he said, "are the best of the best. We are always the first to fight. Our motto is Semper Fidelis, always faithful." He looked like an eagle staring down from a high mountain crag as his eyes swept over his audience of awed young Navajo men. "Soon you may be called up to fight by the draft. If that happens, you will not be able to choose which branch of the armed forces to join. If you make your decision now, you can be sure that you will join the proud and few and become a Marine." I was thrilled by his words and by the way he looked. I had never seen any Navajo who stood up so straight in the presence of important white men, like our principal and several businessmen who sat behind him on the stage as he spoke. They were intent on his every word. He carried himself with such self-assurance and pride that even those big Balaganas were impressed. When his talk was over, I quietly made my way up to the front to listen to more of what he had to say. I did not ask him any questions, but listened closely as he spoke. He believed that any Navajo joining up would have a better chance of getting through boot camp than your average Balagada. His own platoon had been the first ever all-Indian platoon in the history of the Marines, and his instructors had not known what to expect. But the Navajos had surprised them all. "In boot," Johnny Manala said, "a good many of those average men who hope to be Marines can't stand up to the physical challenges." He swung his hand to one side in a dismissive gesture. "They wash out. It's too hard for your average man to get used to marching long distances and carrying heavy packs. Sorry, I'll read that again. It's too hard for your average man to get used to marching long distances and carrying heavy packs, to running and climbing obstacles. It is too difficult to be brave in the face of gunfire. In most recruit platoons, there are even men who have never held a gun." I'll read that sentence again too. I'm so sorry. "In most recruit platoons, there are even men who have never held a gun." When they said that, some of us turned to look at each other. It was hard to believe that anyone, man or woman, could grow up to adulthood without ever having used a gun. Every one of us carried a rifle when we hunted to provide food for our families, or when we were out at sheep camp and had to protect our herds from creatures that might hurt them. "Do you know how many of the 29 men in our platoon watched out?" Johnny Manuelito asked us. "Not even one." I was not surprised. Those things that he said a Marine recruit needed to learn were part of our everyday Navajo life back then. We were used to walking great distances over hard terrain while carrying things. We would stay out with our herds of sheep overnight and in the worst weather. Going for 2 or 3 days without eating was not unusual for us, even those of us who had gone off to boarding school. I did not sign up that day, but my mind was made up. Even though I was now 16, and even though I was still small for my age, I knew in my heart that it was my time to serve as a warrior. I could wear a beautiful uniform and go to see strange places. I would wait no longer. Soon, very soon, I would finally become a Marine.